This video is brought to you by the GCC and looks at some of the writing choices made by those within the robotics discipline. We'll ask ourselves what effect these choices have on readers so that we can better understand which choices are appropriate for different projects. This video will focus on a proof of concept or design paper, which you may have already seen in our workshops. It describes a robot inspired by a lizard's tail. We've already talked about how traditional or experimental papers focus on the results section as the primary part of the paper. But proof of concept or design papers follow a less traditional structure. As we've discussed, the method section of a traditional MRAD is transformed into the design section, which tends to occupy the most space in the paper. Since researchers are presenting something new, whether it's a new method, algorithm, approach, design, or program, that becomes the most important news for the readers. We'll look at the design section of the lizard-inspired robot article in this video, making observations as we read. Keep in mind that design papers in robotics can vary depending on the content, and this article is just one example. It's not perfect. We'll split our discussion into three parts. First, we'll look at the overall headings and subheadings to get an idea of the structure of the design section. Then, we'll take a closer look at the language used in this section, as well as what sorts of content the authors discuss. Finally, we'll touch on data visualization and how figures and tables relate to the text. Almost all robotics papers, and most STEM papers in general, utilize chunking to break up information into smaller and more manageable parts. This is especially useful when we think about how we read these kinds of papers. We sometimes jump back and forth between sections, checking the method section while reading the results, or checking the results while reading the discussion. Headings and subheadings make it easier for readers to locate the information they're looking for, whether they're skimming for specific info or not. This brings us to our first learnable principle: the use of headings and subheadings to strategically chunk information for your readers. Broadly speaking, robotics papers like this one seem to contain general headings with design-specific subheadings, or vice versa, content-specific headings with more general subheadings. Here, we see a general heading for the section Modeling and Analysis, while the subheadings are a bit more specific to the design itself, such as active tail versus active flywheel. The equations of motion subheading is relevant to the specific project, but might be slightly more generalizable for readers working on similar research. So, when it's applicable, it's easy to see algorithms or equations near the beginning of the design section, especially if they play a significant role in the design. Think of it as providing your reader with the information necessary for understanding the inner workings of your design, sort of like context for the design section. However, you might have a different idea for where to include equations in your design section, and perhaps you need context for the equations themselves. There are advantages and drawbacks to every writing choice, so be sure to think about the experience of your reader when working on your specific project. The next heading, Robot Design, is a clear and general title, and will certainly get the attention of readers who are looking for this particular section. The subheadings here are specific to the robot in this paper, but still general enough for readers to understand exactly which part of the robot's design is covered before they read the section. These include mobile robot platform, tail design, and sensing and feedback control. Notice how this paper separates the modeling and analysis and robot design sections, which might offer some advantages but might not always be appropriate. We'll come back to this later. But one thing you might notice about the organization of most robotics papers is that the design section tends to be chronological. In this article, the authors present their foundational equations for motion and justify their choice for a tail design. Then, they discuss their decisions in the design of the robot itself, starting with the body and platform, moving to the tail, then finishing with sensing and feedback control. We can see this in the subheadings alone before we even read into the content of each of those subsections. This is not to say that all papers need to be organized this way, but it can sometimes help you narrate your design and the rationale behind your choices in a way that makes sense to a first-time reader. It's something to consider alongside the needs of your audience. Again, your research might lend itself to a different organizational structure, but use your analysis of papers like these to guide your writing, weighing the drawbacks and advantages of each decision that you make. Next, let's take a look at the content and language in this section. I've highlighted some things in yellow to focus on, but there are plenty of observations that you might be making on your own. First, we'll notice a lot of the first-person plural pronoun we when the researchers explain what it is that they've done. Using we helps foreground the role of the researchers as agents in the paper, and it's quite common in the robotics discipline. In fact, the word we appears 53 times in this text, and the only words that appear more than we are robot, body, tail, and smaller, more common words like the, and, of, and a. Notice how at the beginning of the overall design section, modeling and analysis, the authors describe the information that informs the design of the robot, explicitly stating, to inform the design of our robot, we derived a planar, two-link rigid body model for aerial reorientation with the absolute body and tail angles referenced to horizontal as shown in Figure 3. In the second subsection, the authors address a disc-like design in the relevant literature that is meant to serve a similar purpose as their tail design. It seems like the research that they cite played a role in the development of their own design, and they go on to explain the advantages and drawbacks of both in different circumstances, discussing the predictive models that they used to inform their design and discussion. The authors state, compared to the tail-like design we present here, disc-like inertial loads are not limited in stroke. This is a clear advantage for momentum wheels in situations that demand large rotations of the body, or when angular momentum must be stored for long periods. However, disc-like mechanisms face reasonable limits on size. After discussing some of the predictive models they used, the authors state, our model predicts that momentum wheels are ideal for applications where slow, precise adjustments are necessary, as in satellites or for static balancing. For rapid dynamic adjustments of less than 1/2 rotation, a tail can be more compact and significantly lighter. Then they go on to list other advantages of a tail design. Finally, the authors mention the possibility of a cat-like design, where the tail and the body would both twist to reorient the robot. But ultimately, the authors give reasons for why this design is inadequate for performing the precise types of movements they display with their own design. So, if it's appropriate, it's important to try and compare and contrast your design with others, especially if your design is inspired by, responding to, or building on previous research. This is the spirit of scientific research, and it helps situate your own project within the context of current work in the field. We see the authors in this paper conceding that other designs might be more appropriate for different purposes, but they use words like however to signify where their design differs. This helps justify the choices that they have made in their own research. In the robot design section, the authors move through each component of the robot, noting exactly what their research goals are at the beginning of each subsection. To explore the effects of adding an active tail to an existing robot, we modified a small terrestrial vehicle in the form of a commercial radio-controlled car. Our intent is to describe potential benefits to adding a tail to an existing platform. Hence, we constrain the design space to variables pertaining to the tail only. At this stage, the orientation of the body will be deemed most important. Hence, we ignore tail angle and simply close the loop on body angle. This helps remind readers exactly what the authors are researching in each of these sections, and helps prime them for what to expect as they go on to read through the data that's presented. When writing your papers, it can be hard to remember that your readers don't share the same experiences as you. and that they aren't making the same connections that you might be. That's why it's important to carefully address any questions that you might expect a first-time reader to ask, leaving nothing to chance. Your reader shouldn't have to assume anything about the project. Do that work and make those connections for them. Provide the rationale for your design choices, noting any limitations. Finally, let's take a look at the captions for the figures and tables in this article. First, one general guiding principle is that all figures and tables should be numbered, and that figures and tables are numbered separately from one another. Of course, data visualization might be the most project-specific thing that we've covered in this video, but generally, you should try to narrate your data for your reader. So what does that look like? Try to include a statement both in the body of your text and in your caption that lets readers know what they should be looking for or how they should be interpreting your visualization. If you can give the reader the bottom line of the data, or what we want them to take away, they'll be able to interpret your visualizations better in the context of your overall paper. Sometimes, a takeaway can appear in the caption, but the main takeaway should appear in the body of the text. A good guiding principle for double-checking this is that if the figure were to be deleted, the reader should still be able to understand the main points of the paper or section. In this contour plot, the text explains the main point of the data presented in the figure, and the caption contains information on how to read the contour plot, directing the reader's attention to the red dots. Notice how the body of the text discusses the data in Figure 5. For a tailed design, the length can be made arbitrarily long, and for the case where the relative tail length is equivalent to the body length, then half of the previous rise time is achieved, 33 seconds, as shown in Figure 5. For the disk to acquire the same time performance, its mass would have to be increased to twice the body mass. The authors are not only giving readers information crucial to understanding the plot itself, they're also providing readers with an interpretation of that data and what it means within the context of their project. So, remember that captions should contain all of the information necessary to understand the figure or table. The caption of Figure 8 describes to the reader what happens in the video from which these stills are taken. Video stills might be something that you'll need to include in a paper, so it can be useful to explain what exactly is happening in those pictures. If your reader doesn't have a chance to watch the video, they still should understand what happens and the implications for your project. Let's review our key takeaways from this reading. Use headings and subheadings to strategically chunk the information. Consider placing any equations or algorithms near the beginning of the design section. In this article, the design section is chronological. Use the first-person pronoun we to foreground the actions and decisions of the researchers. If appropriate, compare and contrast your design with others. Provide the rationale for your design choices, noting any limitations. All figures and tables should be numbered, and figures are numbered separately from tables. All figures and tables should be referenced in the body of the text, and captions should contain all of the information necessary to understand the figure or table. Remember that your own projects will vary, and so will your writing. Try to use some of these reading strategies that you saw in this video when reading other articles and when revising your own papers. Be sure to watch our follow-up video on results sections in robotics papers.